Amen. All right. Well, good morning. It is good to see everyone here, and I am looking forward to preaching chapel once again. I truly want to be a help to you. Yesterday's message, of course, geared to, obviously, to the students and why you're here and using your time wisely and trying to use it to grow as the Lord would have you. Not just come to school, not just checking a box because that's what mom and dad said, but realizing life really is all about God and trying to make that transition in your life and going from just simply a disciple to an apostle, to somebody that God can use, to being a usable vessel that God uses throughout your life. Genesis chapter 37 this morning. The principle here, I think, is very important that I want to cover. I think it'll be a help to you not only with decisions that you're making while you're in Bible college, but I think the rest of your life as you serve the Lord. One of being a pastor and even just being a Christian of my own life, within being a pastor, I get this question often, and I've had it myself often, and that is, well, how do you know the will of God? How do I know what God wants me to do? How do you determine that? Genesis 37, I want to use the life of Joseph with help to answering that question. I really don't know how much I'm going to read here. I'd almost like to read the entire chapter, but that would just take too much time. So I'm probably going to jump around a little bit. It says, and Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was, a stranger in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah. Let's jump down now. Well, let me finish that last line there. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. And we'll cover that. Many think that Joseph was simply a tattletale. We're going to see from here, contextually, that simply is not the case. Joseph was a man of integrity. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. When his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright, and behold, your sheaf stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us? And shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more. The third time the Bible says they hated him. They hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. And he dreamed yet another dream. He told it his brethren and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee, to the earth? And his brother envied him. Another word also indicating their hatred for him. But his father observed the saying. Let me go ahead and stop there, and I'll discuss the rest in a second. Father in heaven, Lord, I love you. Lord, I certainly ask your blessing upon your word today. Lord, please help me to be a help. Lord, I pray, Lord, one, help me to stay true to your word and not to veer from it. Lord, I pray that your Spirit would use it, Lord, to change us, to challenge us, to draw us closer to you. Lord, please work on hearts. Lord, may we desire to glorify you so much the more by the time your word is finished being preached. Again, Lord, I love you, and I pray and ask all this in Christ's name. Amen. Joseph's life is an amazing example of a man who finished exactly what God gave him to do. Perhaps my favorite college class that I had was the life of Joseph. I think he's an incredible man. He was a man who found his purpose, and he accomplished it. However, when you think about the life of Joseph, there are many times when it looks circumstantially as if he had no hope of ever finishing God's will for his life. At least how we would view it. He is a great example of what it really takes of knowing God's will and doing it. Think about his life. We pick up here in chapter 37. We're introduced to him. He is 17 years old. with the exception of chapter 38, 13 chapters, the rest basically of Genesis is devoted to the life of Joseph. The family situation he has would be very difficult. An odd family dynamic. Obviously the one dad, 4 wives, 12 boys, at least 2 daughters, but probably more than that. He is the oldest child of the wife of whom Jacob loved. The one younger than him would be Benjamin, of course. We come into Genesis chapter 37. We have him working with Gad, Asher, Dan. Just imagine how tough it would be for Joseph with his brothers hating him. Again, it mentions it directly 3 to 4 times that they hated him. They constantly harass him. They could not speak peaceably unto him. He sees them doing wrong. It was bad enough he knew he had to let his dad know, and I'll cover that more in a second. He had a lot of pressure not to say anything. Perhaps if I let this go, they'll like me. Perhaps if I just don't say anything, I don't have to hear all the negative comments. I don't have to put up with all the harassment. His dad in our text made him a coat of many colors. Now this had great significance. It wasn't just to the fact of his preferential treatment of Joseph, as it refers to him that he loved him, the child of his old age and the first child of Rachel. But we assume this coat had long sleeves. If that is the case, which it is an assumption that we're making because it doesn't tell us directly, but due to other principles from this time frame, it's not unlikely. It's a reasonable assumption that it had long sleeves. And if it did, because it was a coat of many colors, it had another meaning with it. That he had loved him, he gave him the coat, but that meant that he placed Joseph in a position of leadership before his brethren. Which, if you think about it, that makes sense. There was something about Joseph. Everywhere he went, everyone recognized he's a leader. His dad did, put him in a position of leadership. When he ends up in Potiphar's house, he's put in a position of leadership immediately. When he's thrown in prison, he's put in a position of leadership immediately. When he stands before Pharaoh, he's put in a position of leadership immediately. There was something about him that people just knew, that's a leader. He could manage. His dad saw it. With his dad's preferential treatment, obviously that never helped. That was never a good thing. His dad could have used his leadership in a way using much more wisdom than what he did. But he put him in a position of leadership over his brethren who already hated him. In the position of leadership he's in, he had now responsibility. There's very few men you will find in the Bible that have more integrity than Joseph, because Dad gave him a position of responsibility. He knew what he had to do. So when his brothers were doing something against the family business, he was going to report it. It was his responsibility. His integrity always guided him. As we read, the Lord gives Joseph 2 dreams where he is raised above his family. He tells him the dreams. I don't know how much wisdom was in that. But he told them the dream. Of course, his brothers hated him even more. Where we left off, what takes place is this. Jacob sends Joseph to go check on his brothers. It's a bit of a hike. He's about 50 miles away where he thought they were in Shechem, but he was actually in Dothan. So he gets down there. They said, no, your brothers have traveled down. They're down in Dothan. It's another 20 miles where he has to go. And as you know the story, Genesis, I love this portion of Genesis. It's one of those portions, if you just have set reading, like you read 2 or 3 chapters of the Old Testament, so in the New Testament, it's usually one of those portions that you can't stop. You just got to keep on reading and reading and reading and reading. And so they see him coming. They're in Dothan, and sure enough, here comes Joseph. They see him, and so they actually plot to kill him immediately. They're going to do it. Reuben intercedes. He says, listen, we're not going to kill him. And of course, they get him. They throw him into a pit. Reuben heads out, and you could just imagine, there's their brother. He's begging to get taken out of the pit. Come on, get me out of here. Come on, what are you doing? And they're just eating lunch. As you know, he gets sold as a slave. He ends up in Potiphar's house, and he's put in that position of leadership. He is falsely accused of attempted rape, and he's thrown into prison. Thrown into prison. We have no idea how many years he sat in prison. The only thing we know is that he was 17 when our text picks up in Genesis 37, and when he stands before Pharaoh, he is 30. So how many years he actually was at Potiphar's house and before he went to prison, we're not certain. But nonetheless, he spent a good number of years in prison for a crime he never committed. He was the only one of his brothers that was truly sold out, that his life was all about God, and yet he's the one sitting in prison. And we know the story that the butler and the baker are arrested, and it was Pharaoh's prison that he was put in. By the way, think about this. When he was in Potiphar's house, he was learning the Egyptian language. He was learning Egyptian customs, how they thought, how they lived. Think of how important this is going to be in his life, and he has no clue. The butler and baker come in, and of course, he interprets their dreams, and the butler is restored, and the baker executed, and he tells the butler, please remember me. But of course, the butler forgets him, doesn't remember him. Again, all of the sovereignty of God is taking place. Then Pharaoh has the dream, of the cattle coming out and the wheat, the corn. And so the butler remembers, says, listen, there's a man in that prison. You need him. Bring him before you. You need to talk. His name is Joseph. Send for him. He could tell you what these dreams mean. We all know the story. He brings Joseph out. Joseph interprets the dreams. He lets them know we're getting ready to go through 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. It's going to be devastating. We need to do stuff right now. And Joseph comes up with this plan immediately on how to handle the situation. Pharaoh is just amazed by the man's wisdom. And he appoints him prime minister of what at that time was the strongest, most powerful nation in the world. Incredible. And it's just a matter of time. The lean years come, and here comes some of his brothers. 10 of them show up. There they are. Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And we all know the story. He kept back. I don't remember who he kept back. Now, was it Reuben? I can't remember who he kept back. I think it was Reuben he kept back. Or Simon. It was Simon. I can't remember who he kept back one of the brothers, and he sends the other ones back to dad. And he says, listen, I'll believe you that you're not spies if you come back with your younger brother. I want to meet this younger brother you talked about. Let me see this Benjamin. Bring him back with you. And of course, Jacob would have none of it. Jacob was still grieving from the loss of Joseph. He goes, there's no way you're taking Benjamin. This isn't happening. But of course, the famine is exceedingly dreadful on the family. So he finally agrees to it. He sends him, and it's just such a great portion of the story. Joseph sees them all coming. There's Benjamin. He has to go out and weep when he sees all of his brothers. He has them all lined up for dinner there in order. Just incredible. You could just see it, and he reveals himself unto his brethren. And they weep and they cry. And he told them over and over, listen, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Joseph's life really was incredible. There's a lot of ways I could preach this right now, but I do want to focus just on one, and that is the will of God. Joseph finished his course. He did what God wanted him to do with his life. I want to look at 3 things in relation to the life of Joseph and the will of God. Number 1, finding it. Number 2, faith in the will of God. And number 3, fences or barriers to the will of God. Now, number 1, I don't want you to miss this. This is the most important. Finding it. I want you to listen to this statement. You do not find God's will. God's will finds you. You do not find God's will. God's will always find you. When you are obeyed, when you're submitted, when you're serving God, when you're doing what you know to do, and you're just saying yielded and loving God and truly seeking to glorify Him with your life, every single time, God's will find you. You don't have to fret over that. You don't have to determine what's going to happen. How do I do this? God's will find you as you obey the revealed Word of God and you walk by faith. Amen. Look over at Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9. A man's heart devises his own way, but the Lord directeth his steps. I can think of my own life At times when I thought I had to try and determine the will of God. When I had to make sure. I was in New Mexico, I was in the Air Force. The pastor there began training me. I had not finished Bible college yet, but I had now begun it. I started just knocking out classes at New Mexico State and then enrolling on some distance classes from Bible college and trying to get it done. And the church brought me on staff and was paying me a salary. I no longer needed the Air Force. But the Air Force all of a sudden determined they were going to send me to Korea for a year. I did everything I could to get out of the assignment. You want to know why? I was convinced they were taking me out of the will of God. As if God was up in heaven. Like, oh no, this isn't what I had for him. I had him right there. Now look what the Air Force is doing. Oh well, my hands are tied. There's nothing I can do. You shouldn't have entered the Air Force. That wasn't what was taking place at all. Little did I know how God was going to use all this behind the scenes. I had no idea that one day that I would end up in Alaska, that I ended up as a missionary in New Guinea or a pastoring the Independent Baptist Church of Anchorage. Had you told me at 17 or 18 years old, had God said, all right, this is what I want for your life. I want you as a missionary in New Guinea and then serving in Alaska. Could you imagine me trying to figure out how to accomplish that? Never would have happened. The only thing I had to do was stay right with God and obey Him. That's all I had to do. He was in control. He would direct. Matter of fact, I was miserable until I left for Korea, convinced the Air Force was taking me out of the will of God until I got to Korea. I was still miserable as anything. And then I got into it with the missionary there, Bill Stewart. He had one service just dedicated to Bible memorization. And the very first verse I memorized was Isaiah 26:3. And I was at work and working, and I'm going over that verse on my card. It's like I was ignoring what the verse even said, just memorizing it to memorize it. But then it clicked. Thou shalt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. And I realized I have no peace right now, simply because I'm not trusting God. He's in control. He knows right where you're at. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is more than just Sunday school verses. It is trusting in the Lord with all thine heart and leaning not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. It's how it works. There's some truths about God's guidance that I want to give you. God can always put you exactly where you need to be. Every time. Just stay yielded. He will put you exactly where you need to be. God can arrange all the details years in advance. There's not a one of you sitting in this college that the Lord didn't know well before you were born that this time would come, that this time of preparation and this time of training, and now you are a steward with what God has given you. God is more than capable of opening the doors that seem shut so tight. You trust Him. You don't have to force them open. He is more than capable of removing any obstacles in your way. He can even take your choices when you're yielded to Him and fit them into His plan as you serve the Lord. I remember I was taught this as a teenager, this simple principle. I could teach just on this, but it helped me. I was about 18 or 19 when I heard it. I think it was my pastor at the time who had taught it. And he said, you can take the will of God and put it in two areas, the what and the where. He said, the only one you have to worry about is the what of the will of God, and that's just simply obeying this. The where God will put you, what you'll be doing, that's up to Him. You just obey the what, and He'll take care of the where. You just do what you know to do. God will direct along the way. Our responsibility is to follow the Lord and trust in Him like Joseph did. Now with Joseph, when we look at his life, now this was a man, I don't know what word to use for this. I went back and forth. Whether of course he realized God was the pearl of great price. Let me just put it like this. He had a spiritual drive about him. He was genuine. It wasn't just that he grew up in a Christian home. He grew up in the same house all of his siblings did. All of them did. But there was something different about Joseph. He got it. He actually understood that life was about the Creator. He desired to have integrity, not just when Dad was present, not just when a brother was present, because he actually wanted to honor God with his life. You see, God was more than culture to him. He understood it as what life was all about. When that gets in place, it produces a spiritual drive in your life. That's what puts you in a place where you're obedient, you're humble, you're submissive, and God can direct all along the way. We notice this spiritual drive and how it helped him. It helped him not to conform to this world. When he's with his brothers in the field, the easy thing would have been to be just like his older brothers. That would have been the easy way to go about this. Just to conform to them. But what he understood was his brothers weren't serious with their walk. He knew, they had the traditions down. They could check the boxes. But Joseph understood they lacked integrity. From the time Joseph was probably 9 and 10 years old, he saw his brothers doing things. He's like, you know what? Their dad's not around yet. He probably didn't understand that at first. Why is that taking place? I remember I was the first one saved in my family. I started really serving Christ at 15 years of age was when I first got into a youth group. There's about 27 of us in the youth group. You know what stunned me? I'm not kidding at all. I'm dead serious. I was in North Ridgeville, Ohio. First Baptist Church in North Ridgeville. I'm in the youth group. There's about 27 of us. And I realized really quick, I didn't know one of them that took it serious. And at first I was confused. I'm like, wait, if all this is true, because, when I got saved, I was like, man, I saw the truth that I had. I couldn't wait to open the Bible and read it. I remember when the Lord convicted me to bring my Bible to school for the first time, and school had started my sophomore year. My life was completely different from my freshman and sophomore year because now I'm serving the Lord. And I got convicted because I was going through my Bible. The first time I ever read Joshua chapter 1. I'm in Joshua chapter 1, and wow, what an amazing chapter when you've never read it before. And I got convicted to bring a Bible. Know what I did? I found the smallest Bible I could and put it in my pocket. And I brought my Bible to school. But then I got convicted the very next morning. I'm still in Joshua. That's not what I meant. And you know what happened that next day? I brought a Bible. And just like I thought would happen, happened. I made it all the way to study hall. Bible's on top of my books. We're sitting there talking, and one of my friends, Darren Johnson, was the first one to notice it. Boom. Is that a Bible? Yes. The separation began immediately. Lost all my friends. They were gone. They were gone. Joseph was not willing to conform to the world, even if it meant that he would be the social outcast among them. Even if it meant that his brothers are going to hate him, he says, listen, well, who I want to honor above all isn't my brothers, it's God. I will maintain my own way before him. He was a man that truly walked by integrity. And when his dad gave him a position of responsibility and leadership, I personally don't know that even Joseph thought that was a wise move. He knew what he'd have to do. He already knew his brothers hated him. And now he's put in this position of leadership before him, and he knows. He did not conform to this world. We also see in Joseph's life that he obeyed his God-given authority, and that was Jacob. You see it throughout. We also learn as you go through his life that he avoided sexual temptation. You can think where he was at the time, a slave. He could have easily got bitter against God. Here I am serving as a slave and as a servant. I was the one serving God. And in his mind, he could think, I'm a slave. I have no hope of marriage whatsoever. He could have tried to justify that sin any number of ways. But you know what guided him? That spiritual drive for God. That's what I want to honor. Life's not about me. It's not about my pleasure. It's not about what I get. I understand I'm created. It's about him. Now, number 2, faith in the will of God. As you're yielded to God and you're obeying, God's will always require faith. Think about this in the life of Joseph. God appeared to Abraham. God appeared to Isaac. God appeared to Jacob. Did Joseph ever have an appearance of God? He did not. Never had that. I think Abraham was a great man of faith. We see that from Hebrews chapter. I don't question that. But when I look at what takes place in Genesis, to me, the greatest man of faith there is Joseph. He was a man that truly walked by faith, and God's will always requires that, and we're going to see that. You will never accomplish God's will apart from faith. One of the greatest reasons, one of the biggest reasons people leave the will of God is because of a lack of faith in certain circumstances. How about Israel when they came out of Egypt and they're to head into the promised land? You know what kept them from the will of God? They knew it. Lack of faith. How about when the army was facing Goliath? You know what kept the army from accomplishing the will of God? Faith. When you fail to see God in your circumstances, all of a sudden you will find the will of God very challenging. Because the will of God will take you into very difficult circumstances. But like it says we're not going to turn there for time's sake, in Genesis 39:21, this was when Joseph was now going into the prison. And it said it in other places too, but the Lord was with him. In every single place the Lord takes you, He's with you. That first year in New Guinea was more difficulties than I could have ever imagined. What kept me going is simply knowing the Lord is here. The Lord is here. Now, let me get to the third point here quickly. Fences. In other words, what I mean by that is hindrances, things that can serve as barriers to the will of God in your life. I want to cover two things very quickly that are not hindrances to the will of God, that commonly are thought that they are, especially in our culture today. Number one is your background. Joseph had a very tough background. His family dynamic was ridiculous. I mean, imagine coming up in that house with all the complexities, what was taking place in the household of Jacob and the challenges he faced. Listen, your background is not some excuse for you not accomplishing the will of God. It never will be. But we have come up in our Western culture now, things have changed where people are almost proud to be victims of their circumstance. And when you get proud of being a victim of your circumstance, you know what you're going to be all your life? You're going to live to that potential is all you're going to live to. You'll only be a victim. If you get into that mentality, even in Bible college, of the victim mentality, whatever word you put to that, oh, everybody's against me. You know what you're going to view? Every single thing that happens to you as everybody's against you. And you'll never come above that. That'll be your mentality, that'll be your attitude, and that'll carry you through. But I promise you, when it comes to the will of God, your background and those circumstances, that are not what prevent you from accomplishing the will of God. I had a young man come to me. He was 18, 19 years old. He had finished high school, in for counsel, and he desired this relationship with this young woman, but mom and dad weren't for it. So he came in and said, I got to talk to you. He said, I know my mom and dad are preventing the will of God. I said, that's not possible. I said, do you think God up in heaven right now is thinking, you know what? Man, I had this for you, but I forgot about your mom and dad. I didn't count on that. I messed up here. I said, let me tell you something. The only one who's going to remove himself from God's will is you. It's you. I said, if this is God's will, trust Him. You better trust Him right now. Number two, what is not offense to the will of God, listen to me, is your enemies. Now, this portion here depends on how you respond to those who come against you. The importance of staying right before God and trusting in Him. In the life of Joseph, as we look at chapter 37, his own brothers became his enemies. As you determine to do the will of God, listen, there are going to be difficulties and challenges. People will come against you. Just stay focused on God. Stay focused on God. Now, what are some genuine barriers to the will of God? Some fences that can come up. Number one, let me cover the obvious one first. When all of a sudden you get unrepentant sin in your life. It's almost at that point, as God has a will for your life, He shows forbearance and long-suffering and grace and mercy. But understand this, now the whole program switches to leading you to a place of repentance. Now what becomes the priority with God's Spirit leading and guiding in your life is the different measures of chastisement mixed with this mercy to get you to a place back of humbleness and obedience to the Lord. But that sin can grab your heart. All of a sudden you can find yourself like Demas, where the pleasures of this world grab you and remove you from the will of God. Moses striking the rock. This one let me talk about. Bitterness. Bitterness can be an enormous hindrance to the will of God. Let's go back to the life of Joseph for this. Joseph, who of all the siblings is the one that gets it, the one that wants to serve God. You would think, well, he's the one that's going to have God's blessing, going to have God's protection. Of course, what happens to him? He becomes a slave. He's in the pit. His own brothers want to kill him. He's a slave. When he got in that house, bitterness could have set in. God, I am trying to serve you. I don't get this. Why am I the one, a slave here in Egypt right now? God, I don't understand this. God never came to him in a vision and said, Joseph, trust me, I got a plan for all of this. You need what you're having right now. You know what Joseph knew? He knew the entire time, God's in control. I don't understand it, but He has a reason for it. Even though I'm a slave right now in this house, I'm just a servant to this pagan, God's in control. He never allowed bitterness to come in. And then it gets worse, doesn't it? While he is maintaining genuine integrity, he gets accused of rape, thrown into prison. Think of as the days, weeks, and months went by, years went by, how easily it would have been for bitterness to set in. God, I'd stayed faithful to you all these years. Lord, I was the one who put up with the hatred from my brethren because I loved you. I was the one trying to serve you. Now look here I am. I'm 30 years of age. More than half my life now. Here I am. I'm sitting, rotting in a prison. He could have allowed bitterness to come in. You think about this. Let's say he did allow bitterness to come in. Let me show you how quick it removed him from the will of God. All of a sudden, the baker and the butler are thrown in the prison. He hears of their dreams, but you could just see him. Oh, I can interpret those. But I'm done serving God. I'm done. Nope. They're on their own. Want nothing to do with it. God, if you take me out of here, I'll do something. God, if you remove this circumstance from me. No, that's not how this works. Everything, by the way, he experienced, God would use in his life when he was prime minister. But Joseph had no idea that was going to take place. If he allows bitterness to come in, if he allows, and the whole key to avoiding bitterness is simply this, knowing God's in control. Right now, maybe you're a freshman thinking, I don't want to be here. Know this, God's in control. Trust Him. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. No, God's in control. You seniors getting ready to go through interviews. That's going to be an exciting time. And it's amazing how many are going to place. That's one thing. I had 4 of my kids graduate, come through here and grad one year after year after year, 4 years straight. You might think, oh, this is it here. I know. And all of a sudden they hire somebody else. Listen, don't get bitter. God knows exactly what He's doing. He knows exactly where you need to be. You just say yielded and trust in God, and He'll guide and direct. He'll do things greater than you have ever imagined. Just stay close to Him. Make it about God. Now let me cover this too, and I'll finish with this one. This is another hindrance to the will of God for your life. Not being ready. We didn't read it, but if you look at Joseph when he stands before Pharaoh, was he not ready? I mean, think about that. Here he is, 30 years of age, and Joseph knew. Joseph was a man after God's own heart like David. He walked by integrity. I mean, his life was about God, and all of a sudden the day comes, You're going to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and he hears it, and Joseph knows. Know what he knows? This is the moment. You know what clicked in his mind within seconds? Everything he went through, all that God brought him through, he knows this is it. This is the moment. I understood why I was put in Potiphar's house. I understood why I was made a slave. I understood what's happening right now. I am before Pharaoh, the leader of the known world. And Joseph knew there's no way I could have did this on my own. You know what he thought at that moment? I guarantee you, inside his heart, he was glorifying God. That's just incredible what you did. And then Pharaoh, he interprets the dreams, and he doesn't stop. He was ready. He tells, he was a prisoner. A Hebrew prisoner, accused of rape. And he goes on to tell the leader of the world, this is what you need to do. You better prepare for this. And Pharaoh's just like, oh my goodness. You guys hear him? And right before, this man he just met, knew him for minutes. He says, you are now second only to me. He makes him what is the equivalent of Prime Minister of Egypt. Amazing. He was ready when the time hit. When you're here right now, don't waste the time you have. Stay ready. Stay ready, stay ready, stay ready. Listen, the greatest thing in life you will ever do is serve God. There's nothing greater than glorifying God. To when it's all said and done and you stand before the Lord, you know, it's either one of two songs you're going to want to sing at that time. Either I wish I had given him more, or what a day that will be. You don't want to be found ashamed. Be ready.